The heavy crystal glass felt cold and alien in Arthur's worn, calloused hand, a stark contrast to the familiar warmth of a wooden tool handle or the smooth ceramic of his favorite coffee mug. Silence, thick and suffocating, had descended upon the dinner table, a sudden vacuum where the cheerful, self-important chatter of his son-in-law, Mark, had just been. The silence was a physical presence, pressing in on all of them, amplifying the clink of a fork against a plate, the nervous sip of water from another guest. Mark's words still hung in the air, shimmering with venom, a poisoned dart aimed directly at Arthur's heart. "I've been disgusted with you since day one." The declaration was brutal in its simplicity, a final, public condemnation. Arthur felt the eyes of the other guests, Mark's colleagues and their elegantly dressed spouses, slide towards him. They saw what Mark wanted them to see, an old man, out of place in his simple, slightly too large suit, his face a roadmap of years spent not in boardrooms but under the open sky. They saw his quietness as weakness, his humility as failure. His daughter, Clara, sat beside Mark, her face pale, a mask of horrified shock. Her eyes, her mother's eyes, pleaded with him to do something, to say something, to defend himself. But Arthur did not. He simply held Mark's gaze, a profound and unnerving stillness settling over his features. And then he smiled. It was not a smile of mirth or pleasure. It was a small, knowing, and deeply weary smile that did not reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who had heard far worse things from far more dangerous men and had survived them all. To Mark, this smile was the ultimate insult, a sign of senility or foolishness. To the universe, it was the quiet turning of a page, the prelude to a reckoning. For in that opulent dining room, surrounded by people who measured a man's worth by his portfolio, they were all about to learn a lesson as old as time itself, that the most dangerous man in the room is rarely the one who raises his voice. They saw a stooped groundskeeper. They were about to meet a ghost. Welcome to our channel, where we believe that true stories of honor and courage are not always found on the battlefield, but often in the quiet moments of our lives. If you are moved by tales of hidden strength and vindication, and believe in celebrating the silent heroes who walk among us, then please consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful narratives to light, reminding us all that there is often far more to a person than what we see on the surface. Now let us return to that fateful dinner, to that moment of crushing silence, and uncover the truth that lay dormant for decades, waiting for the right moment to finally, irrevocably emerge. The weight of the moment was crushing, a physical pressure that seemed to suck the very air from the room, leaving only the stale scent of expensive perfume and simmering resentment. Arthur's life was a study in quietude, a carefully constructed fortress of simplicity built after the whirlwind of his past and the profound loss of his wife, Martha. His small, second-floor apartment was a testament to this choice. It was not a space defined by possessions but by memories. The walls were a soft, unassuming beige, adorned not with art, but with framed photographs of Martha, of a young Clara with a gap-toothed smile, of a forgotten fishing trip with friends long gone. Every object had a purpose, a history. The worn leather armchair by the window, its seat molded perfectly to his form, was where he read. The small, meticulously organized toolbox in the hall closet was not a hobby, it was an extension of his hands. He worked as a groundskeeper at the local high school, a job he cherished for its solitude and its tangible results. He found a deep, abiding satisfaction in the clean edge of a freshly mown lawn, the sturdy repair of a broken fence, the silent, steady growth of the oak trees he had planted years ago. He was a cultivator, a tender of quiet things. The students saw him as part of the landscape, a silent, limping figure who was always there, clearing leaves in the fall, patching the soccer nets in the spring. They didn't know that the limp, a slight, almost imperceptible drag of his left leg, was a permanent souvenir from a night of fire and chaos in a city whose name was classified. They didn't see the tattoo either. It was on the inside of his left wrist, usually hidden by the worn strap of his Timex watch. It was a faded blue-black symbol, so blurred by time it was nearly indecipherable. A stylized bird, perhaps a raven or a crow, with a single star clutched in its talon. It was the only visible remnant of a life he had buried so deep it felt like it had belonged to another man entirely. He never spoke of it. He never hinted at it. When people asked about his past, he'd simply say, "I was in the service for a while," and leave it at that. It was enough. It had to be. In stark, screaming contrast was the world of Mark and Clara. Their home was a monument to aggressive success. A sprawling, minimalist structure of glass and steel, it overlooked the city from a manicured hillside. Inside, everything was chosen for its statement, for its brand, for the message it sent to visitors. We have arrived. Mark was the architect of this world. An investment banker with a predatory smile and eyes that were always calculating angles, he moved through life as if it were a hostile takeover. He saw weakness everywhere and despised it. From the moment Clara had introduced him to her father, Mark had seen nothing but weakness. He saw Arthur's simple clothes, his quiet speech, his lack of material ambition, and he filed him away in a mental category labeled failure. He couldn't comprehend a man who wasn't constantly striving, climbing, conquering. Arthur's contentment was, to Mark, a profound moral failing. Clara was caught in the crossfire of these two worlds. She loved her father with a deep, primal loyalty. He was her rock, the steady, quiet presence that had anchored her childhood. But Mark's world was seductive. The glamour, the power, the feeling of being at the center of the universe, it was intoxicating. And slowly, insidiously, she had begun to see her father through Mark's eyes. She felt a pang of shame when he'd show up to their pristine home in his decade-old sedan. She'd cringe inwardly when he'd speak in his simple, direct way to their sophisticated friends. She loved him, but she wanted him to be more. Or perhaps less himself. The conflict tore at her, a constant, low-grade fever of guilt and embarrassment. She was an observer of her own life, watching herself become someone she didn't quite recognize, someone who could sit in silence as her husband dismantled her own father piece by piece. The silence that followed Mark's declaration, "I've been disgusted with you since day one," stretched into a taut, unbearable eternity. It was a silence that was not empty, but filled with the unspoken thoughts of everyone present. The two other couples, Mark's colleagues, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were people accustomed to the cut and thrust of corporate life, but this was different. This was not a boardroom negotiation. It was a public execution of a family tie, and its raw cruelty made even their hardened sensibilities recoil. They shot nervous, pitying glances at Arthur, then quickly looked away, focusing on the intricate patterns of their china plates as if they held the secrets of the universe. Clara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Her husband's words were a physical blow, not just to her father, but to her. Every loving memory, every moment of paternal pride, felt cheapened and mocked. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend him, but the words caught in her throat, a tangled knot of loyalty and fear. What could she say? To challenge Mark here, in front of his peers, would be a betrayal of their united front, the carefully curated image of the perfect power couple. So she did nothing. She froze, a spectator at her own father's humiliation. And then there was Arthur. In the face of this verbal assault, he did not flinch. He did not recoil. He simply held his son-in-law's gaze, and that small, enigmatic smile played on his lips. It was this smile that broke Mark. He had expected anger, shame, a sputtering defense, anything but this placid, almost pitying calm. It was as if Arthur was watching a petulant child throw a tantrum. Enraged by this lack of reaction, Mark felt the need to escalate, to shatter that infuriating composure. "Don't you have anything to say?" Mark sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Or are you just going to sit there like you always do? A bump on a log. A ghost at the table." He leaned forward, placing his palms flat on the gleaming mahogany. "You know, I try. God, I try. I try to understand your situation. This life you've chosen. But I can't. I'm built for more. Clara and I, we are built for more. We build things. We create wealth. We move the world. And what do, Arthur? You cut grass. You pull weeds." He laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. "You must be so proud, watching your daughter's success from the sidelines. It must be tough, knowing you couldn't give her any of this." He gestured expansively around the room, at the expensive art on the walls, the view of the glittering city lights. "Did you see the gift I gave her for her birthday? A brand new car. Top of the line. What did you get her?" "Eh, what was it, honey?" "Oh yes. A hand-carved bird. A little wooden bird." He shook his head in mock sadness. "Charming. So very you." Each word was a calculated jab, designed to highlight the chasm between their two worlds, to frame Arthur's life not as a choice, but as a colossal, pitiable failure. The narration of the moment would slow, focusing on the dramatic irony. The audience knows that Mark, in his ignorance, is not insulting a simple groundskeeper, but a man of immense, hidden substance. He was mocking a mountain for not being a skyscraper, unaware of the tectonic power that lay dormant beneath the quiet, weathered stone. The tension in the room thickened, becoming a palpable force, a gathering storm. And at the eye of that storm sat Arthur, perfectly still, his quiet smile a silent testament to a strength Mark could not even begin to comprehend. Clara watched her father, her heart a tangled mess of conflicting emotions. A part of her, the part that had been conditioned by Mark's relentless ambition, felt the sting of humiliation. The hand-carved bird sat on her nightstand, a symbol of a simpler love she had begun to view as quaint, inadequate. Mark's words, cruel as they were, landed on fertile ground of her own insecurities. But another, older part of her, the part that was still Arthur's daughter, saw something else entirely. She watched his hands, resting on the table. They were not the smooth, manicured hands of Mark and his friends. They were a craftsman's hands, the knuckles slightly swollen, the skin cross-hatched with 100 faint, silvery scars from a lifetime of work. They were the same hands that had patiently taught her to tie her shoes, the double knot so it would never come undone. They were the same hands that had built her a treehouse, so sturdy and perfect it still stood in the backyard of her childhood home. They were strong, capable, steady hands. And they were perfectly, utterly still. There was no tremor of anger, no clenching of a fist. There was only a profound and absolute calm. It was this stillness that began to unnerve her more than Mark's outburst. It was not the passivity of a defeated man. It was the stillness of a deep, contained power. As he reached for his glass of water, the sleeve of his jacket slid back a fraction of an inch, just for a second. In the dim, artful lighting of the dining room, she saw it clearly for the first time. The tattoo. A dark, blurred shape on the pale skin of his wrist. She'd glimpsed it before, of course, throughout her life, but had dismissed it as a youthful folly, a relic from a past he never discussed. Now, seeing it in the context of this intense confrontation, it seemed different. It looked less like a decoration and more like a brand, a symbol of an allegiance to something she couldn't name. A memory surfaced, unbidden. She was 7 years old, crying in the yard over a scraped knee. He hadn't coddled her with kisses and platitudes. He had knelt down, his face serious, and cleaned the wound with a quiet, efficient precision that was both gentle and unervingly methodical. "Breathe," he had told her, his voice low and calm. "Pain is a signal. Acknowledge it, then let it go." It was strange advice for a 7-year-old, but she had done it. She had focused on her breath, and the stinging had subsided. She realized now that he was doing the same thing. He was treating Mark's verbal assault like that scraped knee, a signal of pain to be acknowledged, processed, and dismissed without emotional fanfare. This realization sent a tremor of doubt through her. For years, she had accepted Mark's interpretation of her father. Quiet, simple, passive, a good man, but a man left behind by the world. Now a new, unsettling narrative began to form in her mind. What if his quietness wasn't passivity but discipline? What if his simplicity wasn't a lack of ambition, but a deliberate choice? What if the man she thought she knew was just a carefully constructed persona, a shell designed to protect a core she couldn't even imagine? The other guests remained silent, trapped in the crossfire. But across the table, one man was not looking away. Mr. Sterling, the potential business client Mark was so desperate to impress, had ceased all pretense of eating. His fork was laid carefully on his plate. His gaze, sharp and intelligent, was fixed solely on Arthur. He wasn't looking at him with pity, like the others. He was looking at him with an expression of intense, almost forensic concentration, as if trying to place a half-remembered face from a distant, long-forgotten dream. A seed of awareness was beginning to sprout in the room, a shared, unspoken feeling that they were all missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. And that piece was the quiet old man at the end of the table. Mark, misinterpreting the room's stunned silence as a victory, felt a surge of adrenaline. He believed he had successfully framed the narrative, establishing his dominance and exposing Arthur's weakness. Now it was time to close the deal. He turned his attention away from the vanquished, Arthur, and towards the real prize, Mr. James Sterling. Sterling was a titan, a legend in the world of international finance, a man whose firm could make or break Mark's entire career with a single contract. Impressing him was the entire point of this excruciatingly orchestrated evening. "Mr. Sterling," Mark began, his voice shifting from cruel to sycophantic in a single breath, "my apologies for the family drama. Some people are just stuck in the past, you know. They don't understand that in today's world, you have to be a shark. You have to be willing to do what it takes to get ahead." He leaned in conspiratorially, lowering his voice. "It's about calculated aggression. It's about identifying the weakness in the market, or in your competition, and exploiting it without mercy. That's what my team did with the Apex acquisition. The analysts said it was too risky, that the target company's culture was too entrenched. But I saw the rot at the core. We went in, we were ruthless, and we carved it up for a 40% profit in 6 months. He sat back, a smug smile on his face, expecting a nod of approval, a sign of kinship from a fellow predator. To drive his point home, he gestured dismissively towards Arthur with his wine glass. It's a jungle out there, Mr. Sterling. And in that jungle, some people are lions and some are, well, they're just mice. Content in their little holes. Right, Arthur? The question was a final, contemptuous flick of the wrist, a petty kick to a man he thought was already down. The tension in the room, which had been a thick blanket, now solidified into something as hard and cold as diamond. The air crackled with unspoken energy. The camera of the mind would pan slowly, deliberately, across the faces at the table. Mark, smug and expectant. Clara, her face a storm of dawning horror and confusion. The other guests, frozen in place. And then, the camera would settle on Arthur. His hand, the one with the scarred knuckles, rested palm down on the white tablecloth. It was as steady as granite. Not a single muscle twitched. Finally, the camera would push in on Mr. Sterling. The polite, professional mask he had worn all evening was gone. His brow was furrowed, his eyes narrowed. He was no longer looking at Mark. His entire being, his full, undivided attention was locked on Arthur. He was studying Arthur's posture, the set of his jaw, the way he occupied his chair with minimal presence, a lifetime of training in being unseen. He saw the faint, almost invisible scar that traced a line from Arthur's left temple into his hairline. He saw the unnerving calm in his eyes. And then his gaze dropped to Arthur's wrist, to the Timex watch. He saw the sliver of faded ink peeking out from underneath the strap. Recognition, followed by profound, earth-shattering disbelief, washed over his features. The pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving for 30 years suddenly, violently, snapped into place. The mouse at the table was not a mouse at all. It was a dragon, sleeping in plain sight. Mr. Sterling finally broke the silence. His voice, a low baritone accustomed to commanding boardrooms and silencing dissent, cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. It was not loud, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority that seized the attention of everyone in the room. He did not look at Mark. He did not acknowledge the fawning speech about corporate conquest. He spoke directly to Arthur, his tone a strange mixture of deference and disbelief. "Excuse me," he began, his eyes locked on the old man. "I know this is not the time or the place, and I know you value your privacy more than anything. I learned that a long time ago. But I will not, sit here and listen to this." The power dynamic in the room shifted instantly, tilting on the axis of his words. Mark's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Why was this powerful man addressing the irrelevant old groundskeeper? Why was he apologizing to him? I don't understand, Mr. Sterling," Mark stammered, trying to regain control. Sterling ignored him as if he were a piece of furniture. With a slow, deliberate movement, he placed his napkin on the table and stood up. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed, but as he rose, he seemed to gain an extra measure of stature. He was no longer just a CEO. He was a man of immense gravity. The camera would follow his every move. He pushed his chair back, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. He began to walk around the long, polished table, his expensive Italian leather shoes making no sound on the plush Persian rug. The narration would swell, building the epic significance of the moment. History is not always written in books. Sometimes it is written in scars, in silent promises, in the memory of a single night of terror. And sometimes, a man who can buy and sell entire countries, a man who commands armies of lawyers and bankers, will cross a room not for power or for profit, but to stand in the presence of a forgotten kind of greatness. He was not walking towards the host. He was not walking towards the money. He was walking towards the quiet old man in the corner, the groundskeeper, the mouse. He was walking towards a ghost. Clara watched, her breath caught in her chest, as this titan of industry, this man her husband so desperately revered, approached her father with an expression of profound, unmistakable reverence. It was the look of a subject approaching a king. Mr. Sterling stopped directly behind Arthur's chair. He did not speak immediately. He just stood there for a moment, a silent sentinel, his presence a shield for the man who had been under attack. The air was electric. Mark's face was now a canvas of complete bewilderment. His meticulously planned evening was derailing, careening into a territory he could not map or understand. The world, as he knew it, was tilting on its side, and the source of the disturbance was the very man he had just tried to annihilate. Mr. Sterling placed a hand gently on Arthur's shoulder. The contact was brief, but it was charged with decades of unspoken gratitude. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with a raw emotion that stunned the assembled guests into absolute stillness. "The year was 1989, he began, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to make the very air vibrate. He was no longer addressing just Arthur, he was testifying. The Berlin Wall was about to fall, but the old world was not going quietly. I was a young man then, a junior diplomatic attaché, full of theory and ambition, stationed in a forgotten corner of Eastern Europe. A powder keg with a lit fuse." He paused, his eyes distant, seeing a scene no one else in the room could imagine. There was a coup. Swift, brutal. The loyalist government collapsed in a single night. Our embassy, which was supposed to be a sanctuary, became a trap. The perimeter was breached before the alarms even finished sounding. We were taken hostage, 7 of us. The ambassador, his senior staff, a Marine guard, and me, the terrified kid who knew 14 ways to say please don't shoot, and none of them were working. His storytelling was vivid, painting a picture of terror and hopelessness. They weren't soldiers. They were fanatics. They dragged us to a cold, damp cellar in an abandoned factory. They told us they would make a statement to the world. They were going to execute us at dawn, one by one, and broadcast it. We had no communication, no hope of rescue. The world had forgotten us. He looked down at Arthur. But the world hadn't forgotten. Our government hadn't forgotten. They couldn't send in a team. It was too delicate, too risky. An overt military action would have sparked a war. So they sent one man. Mr. Sterling's voice dropped to a near whisper, imbued with awe. They didn't even give him a name. He had a code name. The Gardener. An absurd, gentle name for the most dangerous man I have ever met. They called him that because he could slip through any crack, any wall, any patrol, and silently prune the branches that needed pruning. He came for us in the darkest hour before dawn. There was no explosion, no gunfire, just a series of soft thuds in the hallway. A light switched off, a guard's conversation that ended abruptly. He moved through that factory like a phantom. He neutralized 12 armed men without making a sound. He opened the lock to our cell, and there he stood, a shadow in the doorway. He gestured towards Arthur. He looked different then, younger, harder. But the eyes are the same. Calm. He didn't say a word. He just gestured for us to follow. He got all 7 of us out of that city, through a dozen enemy checkpoints, and to a safe extraction point. All 7 of us. Mr. Sterling's gaze fell on Arthur's left leg. On the way out, we were nearly compromised. A patrol stumbled upon us. He pushed me to the ground, out of the line of fire. He took the bullet that was meant for my head. He pointed to the faint scar on Arthur's temple. And that was from a piece of shrapnel from the grenade he used to give us the seconds we needed to escape. He saved my life. He saved all our lives. And then, at the border, he simply vanished back into the night. No thank you. No debrief. Just a ghost gone. He then looked at Arthur's wrist. That symbol, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The raven with the star. I saw it on his gear, just for a second, in the flare of that grenade. It's not a unit insignia. It was the marker for a deniable operations group so secret, most of the Pentagon has never even heard of it. Project Nightingale. They were the ones you sent when you couldn't send anyone else. They were the ones who walked into hell to pull people out of the fire. And this man, this simple man, was their legend. The revelation detonated in the silent room, the fallout a wave of pure, unadulterated shock. The air, already thick with tension, seemed to crystallize, trapping everyone in a moment of suspended disbelief. For a long, ringing moment, no one moved. No one breathed. There was only the sound of Mr. Sterling's heavy breathing and the quiet, rhythmic tick of the Grand Gather clock in the hall, marking the seconds of a new and terrible reality. Mark's face was a ruin. The color drained from it, leaving a sickly, waxy pallor. His jaw, which had been set in a sneer of arrogant superiority only moments before, now hung slack. His eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, were wide with a horror that went beyond mere embarrassment. It was the existential terror of a man whose entire worldview had been built on a foundation of lies, a foundation that had just been pulverized into dust. He looked from the imposing figure of Mr. James Sterling, the man he idolized, the icon of success, to the quiet, unassuming figure of his father-in-law. The groundskeeper. The mouse. The failure. The hero. The legend. The words echoed in the cavern of his skull, a nonsensical, impossible sequence. The cognitive dissonance was so profound it was almost a physical pain. His mind scrambled to reconcile the two images, the simple old man who couldn't afford a new car, and the secret agent, the gardener, who could dismantle a dozen armed men with his bare hands. The two images could not coexist. One had to be a lie, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the lie was the one he had told himself for years. Clara was weeping. Not loud, hysterical sobs, but silent, streaming tears that traced pathways through her makeup. They were tears of shock, of guilt, of shame, but most of all, they were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking awe. She looked at her father, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since she was a little girl who believed he could do anything. The limp she had secretly been ashamed of was not a sign of age, but a badge of sacrifice, a wound taken for another man. The quietness she had mistaken for passivity was the disciplined silence of a man who had seen too much. The simple, hand-carved bird on her nightstand was not a cheap gift. It was a treasure, crafted by the hands of a hero. Her entire life with him, every memory, was instantly recontextualized. His quiet presence at her school plays, his patient lessons in the garden, his calm demeanor in every crisis. It was all part of the same man, the man who walked into hell and came back with 7 souls. The weight of her own petty embarrassments, her complicity in Mark's scorn, crashed down on her with unbearable force. The other guests were completely stunned, their faces a mixture of fear and reverence. They looked at Arthur as if he might suddenly vanish or transform. The quiet old man at the end of the table was no longer just a guest. He was a historical artifact, a living monument to a kind of courage they only read about in novels. Mr. Sterling, his testimony delivered, placed his hand on Arthur's shoulder one last time. He leaned in close, his voice for Arthur's ears alone, but the reverence in his posture was public. He said something, and though no one could hear the words, the sentiment was clear. Then he straightened up, looked at Arthur, and in a voice clear and steady for all to hear, he said the words that were the final, devastating blow to Mark's ego. "It is an honor to see you again, sir." Sir. The word, a simple term of respect, landed in the room with the force of a judgment. In that single deferential syllable, the entire social hierarchy of the room, so carefully constructed by Mark, was not just inverted, but utterly and irrevocably annihilated. Vindication is a quiet thing. It needs no applause, no triumphant speech. Its power lies in the silence that follows the truth. Arthur, the subject of this earth-shaking revelation, remained the calm center of the storm he had not created. He did not look at Mark. He offered no "I told you so," no glance of triumph. To do so would be to acknowledge that Mark's opinion had ever mattered at all. His focus was entirely on his daughter. He saw her tears, her shattered expression, and his face, which had been a mask of placid endurance, softened with a flicker of paternal concern. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent message that transcended everything that had just happened. "I'm still here. It's okay." With the slow, deliberate economy of movement that defined him, Arthur placed his napkin on the table beside his plate. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping softly against the floor. He stood, his slight limp more noticeable now, as if the weight of the past, once spoken aloud, had settled back into his bones. He turned to Mr. Sterling, who was still standing beside him like an honor guard. Arthur's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, raspy from disuse, and utterly devoid of drama. "It was a long time ago, James," he said, using the man's first name with a familiarity that spoke of shared trauma and a bond forged in fire. "You made a good life. That's all the thanks I ever needed." He then turned his gaze to his daughter. "Clara, it's getting late. I should go." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't ask for his coat. He simply began to walk away from the table, his back straight, his head held not high with pride, but level with a quiet dignity that was more powerful than any display of arrogance. He walked out of the opulent dining room, past the expensive art and the shocked faces, a simple man leaving a world he had never belonged to. He left behind the wreckage of his son-in-law's world. Mark remained frozen in his chair, a statue of humiliation. He was a man hollowed out, his identity, so carefully constructed from money and status and scorn for others, now exposed as a fragile, pathetic sham. He was alone at the head of his own table, the king of a shattered kingdom of glass and steel. Mr. Sterling watched Arthur go, his expression one of deep, abiding respect. Then he turned his cold, furious gaze upon Mark. He didn't need to say a word. The business deal was dead. The professional respect was dead. The evening was dead. Clara, galvanized by her father's departure, rose from her chair. She didn't look at her husband. She couldn't. To look at him would be to see the full scope of her own betrayal. Without a word, she turned and followed her father out of the room, leaving Mark utterly and completely alone in the ruins of his own making. The narrator's voice would return, reflective and somber. True honor needs no audience. True strength requires no validation. It is not a performance. It is a state of being. Arthur walked out of that room the same man he was when he walked in. A quiet groundskeeper who had, once upon a time, been a gardener of a different sort. He had won no argument. He had scored no points. He had simply endured, and in his endurance, in his unwavering humility, he had revealed a truth more powerful than any boast, that the measure of a man is not the noise he makes, but the quiet integrity with which he lives his life. The quiet closing of a door can be louder than a bomb. As Arthur stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the suffocating opulence of Mark's world behind, he took a deep breath. It was the breath of a man returning to his own skin, to a reality he understood and controlled. The drama, the revelation, the shattered egos, they were not his burden to carry. He had carried far heavier things. He walked to his old sedan, the engine turning over with a familiar, comforting rumble. He did not look back. Behind him, a life was imploding. Mark, left alone at the head of a table full of ghosts, would have to confront the hollowness at his own core. Clara, hurrying to catch up to her father, was stepping out of a gilded cage and into the painful, cleansing light of truth. Their story would continue, full of recrimination and regret and the difficult work of rebuilding. But Arthur's story was, as it had always been, much simpler. It was the story of a man who did what was required, and then came home. The narrator's voice, now imbued with a final, philosophical weight, would guide the audience to the moral of the fable. What is the nature of strength? Our world shouts its answer from every screen and billboard. It is wealth. It is status. It is a loud voice and an aggressive posture. It is the power to diminish others to elevate oneself. This is the strength of the brittle, the hollow, the insecure. But there is another kind of strength, a quieter kind. It is the strength of the mountain that withstands the storm not by fighting it, but by being unmovable. It is the strength of the deep river that carves canyons not with fury, but with persistence. It is the strength of a man like Arthur. His power was not in the legendary actions of his past, but in the profound humility of his present. He won not by speaking, but by being silent. He conquered not by attacking, but by enduring. He taught a lesson that night without ever intending to be a teacher, that a person's value is an internal quality, a light that shines from within. It cannot be granted by the praise of others, and it cannot be extinguished by their scorn. And now, we turn the question to you. What does true strength look like in your life? Have you ever misjudged someone based on their quiet exterior, only to learn of the deep waters that ran beneath? Is the loudest voice in the room really the most powerful? Share your stories, your thoughts, your reflections in the comments below. We read every one, because these conversations are how we collectively remember what truly matters. For more stories like this, for more tales that honor the silent heroes, the quiet pillars of integrity that hold up our world, make sure you subscribe to this channel and ring that bell for notifications. You never know when a simple story about a dinner party might remind you of the extraordinary, hidden greatness that walks among us every single day, just waiting to be seen. Thank you for joining us. Remember to look closer. The world is full of gardeners.